in our World Without Work stimulus packet, I found this quote: "One pursues a calling not only for pay or status, but also the intrinsic fulfillment of the work itself." I found this quote interesting because it introduces the idea that work has a greater role in our lives. And so most directly throughout this whole theme of work, I think that you can apply it to job satisfaction very easily. But also, in another packet, we read The Myth of Sisyphus, and that touched on existential themes. And through researching existentialism, you quickly find existential crises. And I thought, I wonder if there is a connection between job satisfaction and existential crises. So this led to the basis for my research, which needed to have two steps to it. So I was asking, to what extent does job satisfaction contribute to an existential crisis? And also that includes, it's bidirectional, so that includes also if an existential crisis can lead to job dissatisfaction, because people define themselves with their occupation. And so if something in their job isn't going well, then often their lives or how their viewpoint won't go well, and that can lead to really negative themes. And so then I want to ask, what steps can we take to lessen this if it's significant enough to attempt to decrease? So to prove the importance or talk about the problem, and there are two steps to this. I'm going to mention that this is a survey line graph from Japan National Survey of Lifestyle Preferences. This is from Japan, so looking into different cultural and social aspects of things. And it's a little out of date, obviously goes till 2005, but you can see that in all of these different aspects of what they've decided to contribute as job satisfaction, then pretty much all of them in the past 30 years have decreased. And so these percentages are showing the percentages of people that responded positively. So like in like 1978, you see like up here for these like having the ability for vacation times and whether or not they're motivated at their job. Only 30 to 35% said that they felt motivated and satisfied with that aspect. And then obviously it's gotten much worse as time went on. So I think there's very good grounds to consider this a significant issue that we should try and develop. And again, this is just job satisfaction. So looking into existential crises, so sources I found that existential crises have all sorts of like psychological repercussions. So if in existential crisis, if people deal with existential ideas throughout their life, it's a question of like, who am I and where am I going? And there's different stages, and I'll touch on that later. But if they aren't resolved, then you can have all sorts of disorders which can lead to depression, and in extreme cases they talk about even attempted suicide, and for just some other significance on a larger scale in a whole society. Again, if there's large groups of people that are not treated or they don't deal with these problems and questions for themselves, then you can have mass dissatisfaction in the work area, and and so then that leads to social economic problems, because not only as a society, but then the economy of like those jobs, there's productivity decreases, and that would affect the whole economy in a negative way. So just to review really quickly the different terms I'm using. So job satisfaction is pretty self-explanatory, but anything that has to do with work, it's how someone, their assumptions or their beliefs, emotions towards their job. Because some people are in a job, like the original Hook quote said, mainly they just want some pay, and it's not necessarily a long-term job, but that still plays a role into their own identity of themselves. And so how they react is going to lead to this idea of existentialism, and whether or not they find their lives fulfilling. And then existentialism as a philosophy is broader, and I eventually took the route of more specific existential crisis, because that was a more like measurable, tangible thing to look into. But the philosophy is interesting. It's interesting to understand, because I think a lot of people, when they talk about existentialism, they think about, the meaningless of life. and like that's kind of the only the first step. And like the idea of saying that life is meaningless and there's no meaning to life is more of another philosophy, nihilism. And so existentialism has the whole part of responding to the problem, which includes projecting the individual who is an existentialist not only sees life meaningless, but they project meaning themselves. So they don't think that there's a natural meaning or higher purpose or greater being or destiny, but they find things that while they're here and they are in life, they find things that they value. And so that's an interesting misconception to address. But an existential crisis answers the question, who am I? And there are kind of 3 different perspectives and age ranges to look into. So I would focus on the sophomore existential crisis is like people our age, high school age, teens, and they look into things like relationships and their occupation and whether or not they'll get a job. So then later on as an adult, you see the ideas of questioning more fundamental things about whether or not they're going to be religious, what is literally sexuality, and the later existential crisis is involved with elderly people, and they might start reflecting and thinking the tough questions about, well, I might die soon. Was my life successful? Did I achieve any goals? Have I accomplished things? And so to address some solutions, the workplace policy could be a way of solving just job satisfaction. So, I mean, a limitation of that is it's one-sided because this connection exists, but only addressing one side doesn't guarantee helping the connection. If you address job satisfaction, there might be a connection, and it might trickle over to existentialism. But this idea involves that there would be the interpersonal communication in the workplace, so that people would talk more and feel like their employers actually cared about them, and that takes a huge role that they found in several studies that it would help the employees feel better about their jobs. And then of course, if they continue to just monitor, the very act of looking and researching that type of thing reassures the employee. And then of course, economically, that kind of takes away from the actual job itself and you distract from the productivity of the workplace. So economically, it may not be the most sustainable. And this would be focusing on the existential idea. And so behavioral training, talking about looking to other perspectives, because as much as an existential issue, people need to look into it themselves, then it does help to look into another person's perspective and see how they handled life issues so that maybe you can apply them to your own life. And again, it's one-sided and maybe inconsistent. So I think I'm out of time already. It's fast. Yeah. But the last thing to say is just I would suggest synthesizing those 2 ideas, as simple as it sounds, and just maybe you have this interpersonal communication at the workplace, but it would also be about the subject of maybe if you've gone through such an existential idea, then that would be one to talk about that subject while on the job, so you handle both ideas at the same time, and so that way you're simultaneously connecting both, even though the connection between the 2 should establish. This way it would be better. And this just connects back to Mythosisyphus and how he all along he'd already figured this out. So I'm not saying that Mythosisyphus had already given me this idea for the synthesis solution, but he had already somehow been able to be satisfied, even though he has like the ultimate dissatisfying job of living forever to do this menial task of pushing the rock up the hill. But somehow he still found joy and existentially his questions of who he is, by reflecting on his existential themes, he found satisfaction in his job because he has time to reflect. So, combining those 2, addressing both, affects both. And so that's what we cited.
Okay, now time for a question.
All right.
So how did your question evolve throughout time as you worked throughout your dissertation?
So I very quickly started with existentialism, and I think it has stayed somewhat the same throughout the whole time, but I realized that it wasn't as argumentative as I wanted it to be. So, by saying to what extent does job satisfaction contribute to existential crises, that is very much kind of an argument to see if there is an argument to be had. But so that's why I wanted to add the thing of if there is this connection, what direction it is. So then I added the second step of, well then, if there is a significant problem, then what should be done, and then that's what I was looking to argue.
Okay,